The southern shore of Long Island has always carried a steady rhythm, where the waves roll in from the Atlantic and fall back again, leaving behind only a faint hiss as they sink into the sand. For generations, this coastline has been part of ordinary life. Families have walked along it on bright summer days. Fishermen have cast their lines into the surf, and couples have wandered at night under the glow of the moon. Nothing about this place suggested violence or fear until the winter of 2010, when the land itself seemed to give up a secret it had held far too long. That December, a police officer was out with his K-9 partner, searching near Ocean Parkway, close to Gilgo Beach. The search was not for what they were about to find. They were looking for Shannon Gilbert, a young woman who had vanished months earlier after making a desperate 911 call. The officer's dog pushed into the brush, pulling insistently as if drawn by something hidden, and what they uncovered was not Shannon, but another woman's remains. The body, partially wrapped in burlap, had been placed carefully and left to the elements. The discovery was unsettling enough, but within only a few days of combing the same stretch of roadside thicket, 3 more sets of remains were uncovered. Each was found close to the others, each concealed with deliberate effort, and each belonging to a young woman who had disappeared without explanation. In total, 4 women had been unearthed, their lives cut short, and their bodies hidden just out of sight of the highway. Their names were Melissa Barthelemy, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello, and together they would come to be known as the Gilgo Four, a name that has since become inseparable from the case. At first, some investigators thought that perhaps Shannon Gilbert had been found among them, that the search which had led them here might finally be over. But it was not. Shannon's body would not be discovered until almost a year later, in a nearby marsh, in circumstances that remain contested and unresolved to this day. With this realization came a chilling truth. The officers were not dealing with one missing woman or a single tragedy. They had uncovered the work of someone who killed deliberately, someone who moved through the shadows and returned to this same lonely stretch of coastline again and again to dispose of their victims. The brush and sand still concealed more secrets, waiting to be revealed. Scattered remains would be found across miles of beach and thicket, some eventually linked to women whose families had been searching for years, others still unknown, their identities and stories lost. From that point forward, Gilgo Beach would never be seen as just another quiet piece of Long Island. The winds that swept across the dunes, the steady crash of the Atlantic waves, and the seemingly endless ribbon of road that ran alongside the shore would now always be tied to one of the most disturbing murder cases in recent American history. This is where the story of the Long Island serial killer begins, with a missing woman, a police dog, and 4 bodies lying in the cold winter brush of Gilgo Beach. The discovery of the Gilgo Four in December 2010 marked the start of a sprawling investigation. But to understand the weight of that moment, it helps to know who these women were and how they had come to vanish from their lives. Each of them was a daughter, a friend, a woman who laughed, loved, and struggled, and each of them found herself caught in the same dangerous current of vulnerability that the killer seemed to exploit. Maureen Brainerd Barnes was the earliest of the 4 to disappear. She was last seen in July of 2007 after traveling from her home in Connecticut to New York City. Maureen was a mother, raising 2 young children, and she had been trying to find ways to support them while managing the financial difficulties that pressed heavily on her life. She turned to escort work advertised online, something she kept hidden from much of her family. And when she left for the city that summer, it was with the promise of quick money. She never returned. For her family, the years that followed were filled with unanswered questions and a painful absence that grew harder to bear with time. Melissa Barthelemy vanished 2 years later, in July of 2009. At just 24 years old, she had been renting an apartment in the Bronx, working as an escort advertised through Craigslist. She was careful, often checking in with her family, especially her younger sister. After Melissa's disappearance, her sister began receiving a series of disturbing phone calls. The voice on the other end was male, cruel, taunting, and he spoke about Melissa in degrading terms, sometimes even calling from her own cell phone. The calls were brief but unforgettable, and they stopped abruptly once police announced they were able to trace them. For her family, those calls remain a haunting reminder of Melissa's fate and the sadistic pleasure her killer seemed to take in their suffering. Megan Waterman was only 22 when she disappeared in June of 2010. She was from Maine, a young mother raising her daughter while navigating a difficult relationship and personal struggles. She traveled to Long Island with a man she was seeing at the time, and on the night she vanished, she was last seen leaving a hotel in Hauppauge. Surveillance cameras captured her walking into the night, but she never returned. Her family back in Maine was left shattered, her daughter growing up without the mother who had loved her fiercely. Finally, there was Amber Lynn Costello. She was 27 years old, living in West Babylon, New York, and like the others, she had been working as an escort advertised online. She was described by those who knew her as witty, spirited, and full of resilience despite struggles with addiction that had taken hold of her life. On the night she disappeared in September of 2010, she was reportedly meeting a client. She left her home and never came back, and within months her body would be found among the others near Gilgo Beach. These four women, Maureen, Melissa, Megan, and Amber, had not known each other in life, but in death they were bound together, victims of the same predator who had chosen them because of the vulnerabilities in their circumstances. All were young, all were involved in sex work arranged online, and all were taken from their families in ways that left behind grief and anger that has never fully healed. When investigators placed the four discoveries side by side, the pattern was impossible to ignore. It suggested organization, repetition, and intent. Whoever had left them there had returned to that same stretch of sand and brush again and again, confident that the bodies would remain hidden, confident that the place itself would keep his secret. But the shoreline could not keep that secret forever. In the weeks after the discovery of the Gilgo Four, the investigation pressed outward along Ocean Parkway, with teams of officers and search dogs combing the roadside brush, marshland, and dunes. What began as the search for a single missing woman had become something far larger, and with each day that passed the sense of dread grew heavier. By the spring of 2011, that dread became reality as the shoreline yielded even more remains. Scattered across several miles, investigators uncovered the partial bodies of additional victims, some found closer to Gilgo Beach and others farther east near Jones Beach and Oak Beach. These discoveries stretched the case from four clear murders to a larger puzzle that spanned years, distances, and methods of disposal. Some victims have been dismembered, their remains left in multiple locations, while others were found intact but similarly concealed in burlap or hidden away in thickets. Among these discoveries was the body of Jessica Taylor, a young woman from upstate New York who had gone missing in 2003. Years earlier, parts of her dismembered body had been found in Manorville, miles away on Long Island, but now additional remains confirmed that she, too, had been discarded along Ocean Parkway. Another woman, later identified as Valerie Mack, also known as Jane Doe No. 6, had been missing since 2000. Like Jessica, some of her remains have been found in Manorville years earlier, and now the connection between those earlier cases and Gilgo Beach became undeniable. There were also remains that told even less of a story, fragments that hinted at lives lost but not yet fully understood. One victim, still unidentified to this day, became known only as Peaches after a distinctive peach tattoo was found on her torso. Another set of remains, that of a young toddler, was found nearby, leading investigators to suspect that the child was related to Peaches, possibly her daughter. Still another set of bones belonged to an Asian male, found clothed in women's attire, whose identity has never been discovered. By the end of the searches, the tally of the dead had grown beyond 10, each representing a life extinguished and a family left without answers. And yet, despite the scale of the discoveries, many of these cases remained disconnected in ways that confounded investigators. Some were last seen years apart. Their remains scattered across time and geography. Others seemed linked more directly, tied together by similar methods of disposal or by their backgrounds in sex work. The question grew more complex with each revelation. Was this the work of one serial killer, returning again and again to a favored dumping ground? Or was Gilgo Beach simply a place chosen by multiple killers over time, a stretch of land remote enough, hidden enough, to become a graveyard for the forgotten? The public, now following the case closely through media coverage, was stunned by the scale. What had begun as a search for Shannan Gilbert had instead pulled back the curtain on something much darker, something that had clearly been happening for years beneath the surface of ordinary life on Long Island. And through it all, the mystery of Shannan herself remained unsolved. Shannan Gilbert's story lies at the very heart of the Gilgo Beach investigation, not only because her disappearance set the search in motion, but because the circumstances surrounding her death remain among the most haunting and disputed of them all. On the night of May 1st, 2010, Shannan was in Oak Beach, a quiet, gated community just a short drive from Gilgo. She had arranged to meet a client there, something she had done many times before in other places. Shannan was 24 years old, an escort who had grown up in New Jersey and dreamed of becoming a singer. Those who knew her described her as creative, ambitious, and sometimes restless, trying to find her footing while navigating the difficulties of life and work. That night, however, something went terribly wrong. Just after 4:50 in the morning, Shannan made a frantic 911 call that lasted 23 minutes. In it, she told the dispatcher that someone was after her, that she feared for her life, and she refused to stay calm despite repeated attempts to keep her on the line. Her voice was panicked, disjointed, sometimes difficult to understand, but the fear was unmistakable. Shannan fled the client's home and began running through the neighborhood, banging on doors and pleading for help. Some residents later reported seeing her, disoriented and terrified, but by the time police arrived, she had vanished into the early morning darkness. For months, her whereabouts remained unknown. Unlike the Gilgo Four, whose remains were found that December, Shannan's body was not discovered until December 2011, more than a year and a half later. Her remains were located in a marshy area near Oak Beach, close enough to where she had last been seen that some investigators believe she had wandered there in panic and become trapped in the marsh. The official conclusion by some in law enforcement was that Shannan's death had been accidental, that she had drowned or succumbed to the elements after fleeing into the wetlands. But her family, particularly her mother, Mari Gilbert, never accepted that explanation. They believed she had been murdered, perhaps by the same person responsible for the other killings, or at the very least that foul play was involved in her final moments. Their suspicions were fueled by several factors: the desperate 911 call, the reports from residents who said she had been begging for help, and the eerie proximity of her body to the cluster of other remains. How, they argued, could this simply be dismissed as an accident? The debate over Shannan's death has never been resolved. For some, her panic and her flight through the neighborhood suggested she had seen or experienced something that terrified her beyond reason. For others, her erratic behavior pointed to possible mental health struggles or substance use that might have driven her into the marsh. The truth has remained elusive, and with each passing year, the mystery has only deepened. But one thing is certain: without Shannon Gilbert, the bodies at Gilgo Beach might have stayed hidden much longer. It was her disappearance, her terrified call for help, and her family's relentless search that drew law enforcement to Ocean Parkway, where the secret graveyard began to reveal itself. After the discovery of the Gilgo 4 and the subsequent remains, investigators found themselves faced with one of the most complex crime scenes in modern American history. Dozens of detectives, federal agents, and crime scene technicians were brought in, combing through miles of brush and sand. Forensic labs processed evidence around the clock, while behavioral analysts attempted to construct a profile of the killer. And yet, even with the scope of resources applied, the case stubbornly resisted answers. Early on, law enforcement considered the possibility that the deaths were the work of multiple killers. The differences in method, some bodies intact, others dismembered, seemed to suggest more than one perpetrator. But the similarities, such as the use of burlap to conceal several victims, argued for a single organized predator who had adapted his methods over time. The FBI was brought in to assist with criminal profiling, offering psychological insights into who this person might be. Attention quickly turned to Oak Beach itself, because Shannon Gilbert's disappearance had occurred there, and because the area was so close to the burial sites. Residents and frequent visitors became subjects of interest. One of the first to draw attention was Dr. Peter Hackett, a local physician who lived in the gated community. He had reportedly contacted Shannon's family shortly after her disappearance, claiming he had run a home for distressed women and that Shannon had been there before she vanished. Later, Hackett denied making the call, but phone records showed otherwise. While suspicion lingered around him for years, no evidence ever tied him directly to the murders. Another person of interest was Joseph Brewer, the client Shannon had visited the night she disappeared. Brewer maintained that Shannon had fled his home in a sudden panic, and investigators never found evidence linking him to her death or to the Gilgo victims. Similarly, a man named James Bissett, who owned a local nursery that sold burlap, came under scrutiny after he died by suicide in 2011. Rumors spread about his possible involvement, fueled by the burlap connection, but again, no solid evidence surfaced. The lack of progress fed a storm of speculation. Armchair detectives, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts all poured over the case, offering theories about whether the killer was a police officer, a fisherman familiar with the tides, or even someone with ties to organized crime. Some suggested that the beach had been used by more than one killer, turning Ocean Parkway into a kind of dumping ground for unrelated crimes. For the families, each passing year without answers was agony. Press conferences were held, vigils organized, and appeals for information broadcast widely. Yet behind the scenes, law enforcement struggled with limited evidence. The remains had been exposed to the elements for years, erasing much of what could have been left behind. There were no confirmed eyewitnesses to the abductions, no clear forensic trail, and the suspect list remained broad and unsatisfying. Despite the difficulties, investigators pressed on, building timelines of each victim's last known movements, cross-referencing phone records, and analyzing digital footprints from escort advertisements. They traced calls made to the women's phones, scoured Craigslist postings, and even looked into similar cases in other states. But for every lead pursued, another dead end appeared, and the killer, or killers, remained hidden in the shadows. As the years stretched on, Frustration mounted both inside and outside the investigation. The case became a haunting symbol of how, even in an age of digital tracking, surveillance, and advanced forensics, someone could take life after life and vanish into anonymity. For more than a decade, the Gilgo Beach murders lingered in a haze of frustration and unanswered questions. Families of the victims pressed for action. The public's interest never fully waned, and investigators quietly kept working, but year after year passed with no arrest. It seemed that the killer had succeeded not only in hiding his identity, but in outlasting the investigation itself. Yet time, in the end, began to work against him. By the late 2010s, advances in forensic science and digital analysis offered investigators tools that hadn't been available when the bodies were first found. Cell tower data, which could map the rough location of phones when they connected to service, was re-examined. The calls made to arrange meetings with the women, as well as the cruel phone calls Melissa Barthelemy's sister had received, became points of renewed focus. Investigators overlaid these phone movements with traffic patterns, work schedules, and even potential vehicles to narrow down possibilities. The burlap used to wrap several victims also provided an investigative thread. Though common in some industries, its presence as a concealment method was unusual enough to suggest a specific source. Investigators compared suppliers, buyers, and local businesses that might have used similar material, slowly tightening the circle of possibilities. DNA, too, began to offer hope. While the condition of the remains made it difficult to collect usable evidence, small breakthroughs became possible as technology advanced. Familial DNA searches, where investigators look for relatives of an unknown suspect within public or law enforcement databases, had proven successful in other cold cases, and hopes were high that the same might happen here. The case took a dramatic turn in 2022 when a new task force was formed under Suffolk County's District Attorney's Office. This team brought together local police, state investigators, and the FBI in a renewed, concentrated effort. Fresh eyes on old evidence, combined with the latest technology, began to untangle threads that had once seemed hopelessly knotted. And then, in July 2023, the announcement came that stunned the public. An arrest had been made. The suspect was Rex Hoyerman, a 59-year-old architect from Massapequa Park, Long Island. Married, with children, and seemingly an ordinary suburban life, Hoyerman had lived less than a half hour from Gilgo Beach. His professional life was stable, even prestigious in some respects, but behind a mask of normalcy, investigators alleged he had harbored a dark double life. Cell phone records played a key role in his identification. Investigators alleged that burner phones used to contact victims had often pinged near his office in Manhattan during the day and near his home in Massapequa at night. The movements of these devices mirrored Hoyerman's own commute, drawing a damning connection. DNA evidence sealed the case further. A hair found on one of the victims was linked through testing to Hoyerman's family and later directly to him. Trash pulled from outside his home also provided matching DNA, strengthening the chain of evidence. Prosecutors accused Hoyerman of the murders of 3 of the Gilgo 4, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Melissa Barthelemy, and Megan Waterman. Charges related to Amber Costello followed soon after, though investigators made clear they were continuing to explore his possible connection to other remains found along Ocean Parkway. For families who had waited over a decade for answers, the arrest was both a relief and a heartbreak. Relief that at last, someone was being held accountable. Heartbreak that the years of waiting had passed without their loved ones by their side. For the public, the arrest reshaped the image of the Gilgo Beach killer. He wasn't a shadowy figure hidden deep in the dunes or a transient predator passing through. He was a man with a wife, children, and a career. He was a neighbor, someone who shopped at local stores, commuted into the city, and blended seamlessly into the background of suburban life. The unmasking of Rex Hoyerman did not bring the story to an end. It opened new chapters, raising questions about how many victims there might truly be, how long the killings may have gone on, and whether the beach's haunting tally of the dead was the work of one man alone. The arrest of Rex Hoyerman shocked not only the victims' families, but also his own neighborhood. People who had lived near him for years described him as reserved, even awkward at times, but never outwardly threatening. His house in Massapequa Park, a weathered and cluttered home on a quiet street, became the focus of media attention. Neighbors recalled how the property stood out, overgrown, run down, and oddly out of place in a tidy suburban setting. Yet even with its disrepair, few could have imagined the secrets it might hold. Hoyerman was a licensed architect, running his own firm in Manhattan. His clients ranged from businesses to private individuals, and colleagues described him as meticulous and deeply involved in his work. On the surface, he was a professional who commuted daily into the city, maintained a business, and provided for his family. At home, he had a wife and 2 children. To the outside world, his life looked ordinary, even mundane. But as investigators peeled back the layers, a darker picture emerged. Hoyerman had allegedly used burner phones to communicate with victims, carefully hiding his identity while maintaining his suburban routine. He had reportedly searched online for disturbing material, including details about the Gilgo case itself, as though keeping track of whether investigators were getting close. When news of his arrest broke, his wife and children were blindsided. They had never been under suspicion, and investigators quickly confirmed they were not involved. But the impact on them was immediate and devastating. Their home was searched extensively, personal belongings turned over, and their lives thrust into the spotlight of one of the most notorious cases in recent history. The juxtaposition was chilling. A family living what they believed to be an ordinary suburban life, only to discover their husband and father was accused of being one of America's most infamous serial killers. The shock extended far beyond Massapequa Park. Across Long Island and into New York City, people struggled to reconcile the image of an architect in a suit and tie with the gruesome reality of the charges against him. Hoyerman became yet another name on the long list of killers who had managed to hide in plain sight, using normalcy as his greatest disguise. The parallels to other cases did not escape notice. Like Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, Hoyerman allegedly balanced a life of family, work, and routine while harboring a secret predatory side. The fact that he had managed this balance for years, possibly decades, without detection only deepened the unease. For investigators, the arrest was a triumph, but also the beginning of a new phase. They now faced the daunting task of combing through years of Hoyerman's life, searching for connections to other unsolved cases, both on Long Island and beyond. Did his crimes begin in the late 2000s, or had they stretched back further? Could he be tied to the unidentified victims found along Ocean Parkway? These were questions that could not be answered immediately, but they weighed heavily on everyone connected to the case. And for the families of the victims, the arrest reopened old wounds even as it offered hope for justice. Seeing Hoyerman in handcuffs, a man who had lived so close and yet gone undetected, was a reminder of how fragile safety can be, how even the most ordinary-seeming life can conceal unimaginable darkness. In the weeks following Rex Hoyerman's arrest, Suffolk County and the wider world were consumed by the unfolding case. Courtrooms filled with reporters, true crime enthusiasts, and families of victims, all eager to see the man who had been accused of haunting Long Island for over a decade. Hoyerman appeared in shackles, dressed not in the sharp suits of his professional life, but in the plain attire of an inmate. The transformation from respected architect to accused serial killer was jarring, and it drew international headlines. Prosecutors laid out their case with meticulous detail. They spoke of the burner phones, the DNA evidence, the cell tower pings that traced his movements, and the fibers found with some of the victims that could be linked back to items in his home. They presented Hoyerman as a man who had carefully planned his crimes, hiding them beneath the cover of suburban normalcy. Defense attorneys countered that the evidence was circumstantial, that the investigation had spanned over a decade with many dead ends, and that Hoyerman had been unfairly targeted due to proximity and coincidence. The hearings became spectacles in themselves. Cameras captured every moment of Hoyerman's expressions, every word spoken by the prosecutors, and every anguished reaction from families in attendance. True crime podcasts dissected each new revelation, while nightly news programs ran long segments on the case. On social media, theories flourished. Some convinced that Hoyerman was guilty of far more than the charges he faced, others skeptical of the investigation's narrative. For the families, being in court was a painful reminder of their losses. The sight of the accused was difficult to bear, and the process of hearing evidence relived the trauma of each death. Yet many of them expressed determination, saying that seeing the case move forward gave them strength. The arrest, the trial, and the possibility of conviction offered a path, however painful, toward closure. Outside the courtroom, the case reignited conversations about how such a predator could operate for so long undetected. The failures of early investigations were scrutinized. Why had it taken so long to coordinate resources? Why had certain leads been ignored or downplayed? Could earlier action have saved lives? These questions did not fade, and they remain part of the legacy of the Gilgo Beach case. In the broader world of true crime, the case became a touchstone. Documentaries revisited the years of mystery, examining the police missteps, the role of technology, and the sheer persistence required to bring a suspect to justice. Authors began drafting books, some focusing on the victims and their lives, others analyzing the systemic failures that let the case drag on for over a decade. The story of Gilgo Beach was no longer only about the killings themselves. It had become a lesson in how fragile justice can be, and how perseverance, technology, and community pressure can eventually shift the tide. Even with the arrest, the specter of the unknown lingered. Questions remained about the other bodies found along Ocean Parkway. Were they all connected to Hoyerman, or did the area serve as a burial ground for multiple killers? Investigators remained cautious, insisting that while they believed Hoyerman was responsible for at least several of the murders, they could not yet claim he was responsible for all. The uncertainty continued to haunt the case, a reminder that some mysteries refused to be neatly tied off. Even as Rex Hoyerman's arrest promised accountability, the Gilgo Beach case resisted closure. The arrest explained some of the mystery, but not all of it. Along the same stretch of Ocean Parkway where the Gilgo 4 had been discovered, the remains of other victims had also been found, and for many of those, identity remained unknown. Their presence complicated the narrative, suggesting that while Hoyerman may have been responsible for several murders, the sands of Gilgo Beach may still hide the work of others. Among the most haunting mysteries were the unidentified victims. Jane Doe 3, also known as Peaches for the distinctive tattoo of a peach on her body, and Baby Doe, a toddler believed to be her daughter, were found years apart but linked through DNA testing. The discovery of a child in connection with this case stunned the public, introducing a new depth of cruelty to an already grim story. Another set of remains, dubbed Asian male, pointed to a victim who stood apart from the others both in gender and in details of death, further challenging any attempt to draw a single narrative thread. These identities, or the lack of them, linger as shadows over the investigation. Families of missing persons across the country looked to the Gilgo discoveries with both hope and dread. Each announcement of new DNA testing sparked calls from people who had lost loved ones, wondering if the beaches of Long Island held their answers. The unidentified remain a silent testament to lives interrupted and a reminder that the full truth of Gilgo Beach may never be neatly cataloged. The cultural impact of the case spread far beyond Suffolk County. Gilgo Beach entered the lexicon of true crime alongside places like Whitechapel, Amityville, and Jonestown, ordinary settings that became synonymous with violence and fear. The story was dissected on streaming platforms, late-night news, and in podcasts listened to by millions. For many, the Gilgo Beach murders became not just a criminal case, but a symbol of the persistence of evil hidden behind suburbia's calm facade. The very geography of Long Island played into the public imagination. Ocean Parkway, with its lonely stretch of road bordered by dunes and marshland, became iconic. Its beauty by day seemed to contrast cruelly with the darkness it had concealed by night. Photographs of the beach, once merely local scenery, began to carry with them the weight of horror. Residents spoke of how they could no longer drive the parkway without thinking of the bodies that had been left just out of sight. The unease was not only emotional, but practical. If Hoyerman was indeed guilty of the murders for which he was charged, how many others might he be responsible for? Could he have used his access to Manhattan, with its vast anonymity, to claim victims there as well? And if some of the remains were not linked to him, did that mean there had been more than one killer using the same haunting stretch of beach? Such questions remain unanswered, and perhaps they always will. That ambiguity is part of what has cemented Gilgo Beach in the darker corners of American memory. Even in an era of modern forensic breakthroughs, some truths still slip through the cracks of certainty. As the years have passed, and as the case continues its slow journey through the courts, the Gilgo Beach murders have come to symbolize not just the horror of a predator, but also the resilience of the families left behind. Each victim had a life beyond the label of escort or Craigslist ad. There were daughters, mothers, sisters, and friends. Megan Waterman had a young child waiting for her. Melissa Barthélemy spoke regularly with her family until the calls abruptly stopped. Amber Costello was remembered for her humor and her warmth. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, the first of the Gilgo Four, had been striving to build a stable future despite hardship. Their lives, complex and human, are the heart of this story. For the families, remembering their loved ones has become both a burden and a mission. Candlelight vigils are held on anniversaries. Photographs are shared at press conferences, showing faces smiling before tragedy struck. The victims are more than case files, more than evidence logs. They are people whose stories deserve to be told and retold, so that they are never lost to the anonymity of unsolved crimes. In many ways, the Gilgo Beach murders have reshaped how society talks about vulnerable communities. For years, crimes against sex workers often went unnoticed or uninvestigated. The Gilgo case forced uncomfortable questions. Had the victims been taken seriously from the beginning? Would the killer have been caught sooner? Would fewer lives have been lost? These questions cannot be undone, but they stand as lessons, pressing society to value every life equally, regardless of circumstance. There is also the strange duality of time that hovers over the case. For more than a decade, it lingered as an unsolved mystery, the kind that haunted detectives and kept families awake at night. Then, in the span of a few weeks in 2023, everything shifted. An arrest, charges, and a name put forward as the possible killer. And yet, even with progress, the shadows remain. Questions persist, and uncertainties linger like the waves that roll endlessly onto the sands of Gilgo Beach. This is the moment our story comes to a close. The Gilgo Beach murders remind us how fragile safety can feel, how deeply secrets can hide within the ordinary, and how long the journey to justice can be. Though there is more to uncover and answers still withheld, the lives lost remain the beating heart of this tragedy. Thank you for listening to the story of the Gilgo Beach murders. Feel free to find more capturing stories from the true crime series here on this channel. Until next time, may your night be calm, and may you drift into rest with gentler thoughts than the ones we've lingered on tonight.